Welcome. Before we get started, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping bits so you can get the most out of the session today. The screen you're looking at is fully customizable. You can move and resize any of the windows and drag them into place to suit you. There's also a toolbar at the bottom where you'll find the Q&A box to input questions to the panel, which we'll aim to cover at the end of the session, but if we don't have time, we'll follow up with you afterwards. You'll also find additional resources, so the slides presented today and speaker bios. And finally, you can enter your details in the contact us box and we'll get back in touch with you following the event. Don't worry about taking notes, we'll be recording this session and we'll send you a copy afterwards. If we haven't met, I'm Rena Christou. I'm an employment lawyer and director of Halborns, and we're a Times top 10 employment law firm who take the unique approach to proactively keeping clients in our focus with solutions and straight talking advice. And that's exactly why we're launching our culture calendar, designed to bring you thought-provoking, trend-setting conversations, supporting individualism, engagement and innovation. In celebration of Pride, our first culture calendar event is kicking off the conversation with gender identity. And in today's session, we're joining forces with Gender Identity Research and Education Society, GIRES, who can share with us practical real-world guidance on the gender identity. And I'd like to hand over to introduce you to Octavian, who can tell you a little bit more about what he does and his role at GIRES.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Rena. I am Octavian Starr, and I am a trainer and a trustee board member of GIRES, which was started back in 1997 in response to the founder's trans daughter being discriminated against at work. And this organization has always been put forward to be an education-based charity to help people understand trans and gender diverse communities a bit better and make it a better place for everyone to be.
Amazing, thanks Octavian. Really looking forward to hearing your practical insight today. And we're also joined by Emily Charlesworth, who is a HR technical consultant at AdviserPlus, our partner company in the Empowering People group. Emily, can you tell us a bit more about you and AdviserPlus?
Yes, thanks Rena. Happy to be here. So AdviserPlus provides innovative employee relations technology and advisory services. They support clients across a breadth of industries, and they include household names as diverse as Virgin Atlantic, BT, United Utilities and Sainsbury's. We pride ourselves on delivering a unique service that puts employee experience at the heart of everything that we do. For myself, I've been at AdviserPlus for over 7 years, and I'm proud to be one of the founding members of the AdviserPlus Inclusivity Plus team, which was created to help raise awareness and champion equality and inclusion through policy reviews, special events, and inclusive celebrations. I'm a member of the LGBTQ community myself, and so I'm really happy to be able to join the discussion today and to bring insights from both my personal and my workplace experiences.
Amazing, thanks Emily, and looking forward to hearing your insights. So let's kick off. With a recent Total Jobs survey highlighting that almost half of trans people have quit their jobs because their work environment was unwelcoming, and a third stating they'd experienced discrimination in the workplace, it has clearly never been more important to understand how we can make the workplace a more inclusive space. Now, we haven't got accurate statistics at present, but it's estimated that around 600,000 people in the UK identify as trans, including non-binary. We'll actually have a much better understanding this year because for the first time ever, the 2021 census has asked the public about their gender identity. And in fact, the Office for National Statistics is anticipating that there'll be at least 80 different self-descriptions submitted in answer to the question, which shows just how wide gender identity is and how personal it is. I do want to say before we kick off, in terms of our discussion today, the language we're using when we're talking about gender identity is vast and ever-changing. So the terminology that we'll be using today is appropriate at the time we're making this recording, but it's important to bear in mind that it may become outdated. And although these terms are useful to enable us to have discussions about gender identity, they may not always be welcomed by the people they're being applied to. Now, don't worry if you're not clear on different terminology, we'll go through that together in a moment. But I thought to get us started, Octavian, you can talk us through what we mean by gender identity and gender expression.
So, yes, thank you so much. So the easiest way to kind of think about these things for me is to talk about it in terms of where things may lie, right? So when we talk about gender identity, this is the sense of ourselves. This is who we are, who we feel we are, who, you know, what is the most authentic version of ourselves. And gender expression is then how we express that. The clothes we wear, the makeup we do or don't wear, you know, the things that we do to present our gender identity. You know, we express ourselves in lots of different ways, and everybody expresses their gender, not just trans people, you know, wearing dresses over, you know, pants, or wearing a certain type of thing, or wearing makeup or having tattoos. These are all expressions of ourselves or expressions of our identity. And in a lot of times they are expressions of our gender. But people who are not trans or gender diverse don't usually think about it in that context because they haven't really ever had to. But these are all gender expressions, right? So then a person's sex is more biological. So this is more, you know, what person's chromosomes and, you know, kind of sex characteristics they were given at birth. Now, that's important to note that that's not always cut and dry. You know, like lots of people like to say, well, there's, you know, XX and XY chromosomes, you're either this or that. Well, actually, biologically, sorry about that. Biology actually is more complicated than that. And there's actually XXY, YXOX, XYXO, and most people who have different types of what's called sex characteristics. They're internal, not external. So these are not things that you necessarily know, and most people don't. So important to just note that things are a lot more diverse from the very get-go than a lot of people kind of know, and that's totally fine because, you know, this is something, even as a trans person, that I have learned more and more about every year. So, you know, there's all these things tied together, right? All of these things work together in terms of our experiences, the way people have presented to us, the way people have told us to present, the way people see us, the way we present the place that we're from. So, you know, training from this country, of course, I'm coming from a Western perspective, and generally most people are, but you have to remember that gender identity, gender expression, these things look different from different viewpoints. You know, so if somebody comes from a non-Western culture where maybe there was already more than two genders, which there are a lot, then, you know, their viewpoint's going to be different. They may not understand why somebody doesn't understand the way that they're expressing their gender or identifying their gender, you know? So it's important to think about how wide and how diverse viewpoints are as well. You know, you have to remember the lens of which you're viewing yourself and others.
Do you often see it being confused with a person's sexual orientation?
Oh yeah. So I mean, again, this is like, what lens are you looking at things at? You know, so sometimes people equate, you know, people that they think of as men being feminine as being gay, where in some cultures, actually being more in touch with your femininity makes you more masculine. So it really depends on what lens are you looking at things at. You know, what is the perception of that person? Where are they coming from? What's the culture they were raised in? Maybe it's religion, maybe it's a certain sort of, you know, cultural rules that they were brought up with, or maybe they were brought up in a culture that was completely different, you know. And some of these cultures that have, I would say, kind of more fluid views on gender and sexuality are quite small. So, you know, the general view is the kind of Western bipartisan two-party system, right? But there are a lot of people who don't believe that way, or have been raised in different ways, or have raised themselves in different ways. And so it really depends, because what one person may see as feminine or masculine may be completely different from someone else. And I think a lot of times people are really held to a high standard sometimes, to say it is very bad for you to be perceived this way. So if you act in these ways, that is bad, and people are going to hurt you or harm you, which unfortunately, you know, especially for trans feminine people, especially trans feminine people who are not white, you know, the hate crimes have gone up, you know, over 200%. So, you know, people do believe, and are right in a lot of ways, to be scared of how they present themselves because of overreaching views that if you look a certain way, that equates you to being, you know, something very bad, like a pedophile or a predator, which you're hearing a lot of even in the States. You know, there's don't say gay bills and things like that. And so these gets equated with presentation. So regardless of how somebody identifies, if somebody's presenting in a certain way, then these negative connotations can be attached. And it's difficult because presenting in a certain way does not mean that you identify that way. You know, gender and sexuality are completely different. you know, sexuality is who you're attracted to, who you love, gender is who you are, right? So those two things, of course, they can overlap because who you are could have, you know, does influence who you're attracted to, but it's not the same thing at all. They're completely different things, you know, and a trans person could be attracted to women, and then so they identify, let's say, a trans man, so somebody who is, you know, identified female at birth, like me, they could, you know, be solely attracted to women and be identified as a lesbian, then transition and then be identified as a straight man, right? Or they could identify as gay and date women and then transition and then identify as gay and date men, right? Which also happens. So, you know, or they could be pansexual or bisexual or all these things, but gender identity does not equate or, you know, kind of predict what your sexual orientation is going to be.
No, that's really useful. And I think it's really interesting in terms of what you said about people feeling the need because of those pressures to hide their identity. Again, even more so at work. So there was a really interesting study that I'd read recently that said 65% of trans people hide their identity at work, which is a pretty shocking, you know, that's 2/3 of kind of that population. And interestingly, again, around 50% felt that they had to leave their jobs because they felt unwelcome, which, you know, actually is a problem for employers. It means that there's a loss of expertise there, investment of people that could otherwise be retained in a more inclusive environment. So for me, it feels obvious, and we know that there's a wealth of research to show that workplaces that are more inclusive are also more productive. So let's be honest, it's not just the right thing to do, it also makes good business sense. You know, when people feel valued as an individual and engaged, they're more likely to go the extra mile. So you see that discretionary effort. They stick around longer, so you've got loyalty, which, let's be honest, with the Great Resignation, as everybody's titling it, it's never been more important to hold on to great people. And what I think is really, you know, was quite shocking for me is around absence levels as well. So if you've got somebody that feels disengaged, that, you know, isn't comfortable in the environment that they're in, the reality is that you're going to see higher absence levels because there's going to be an impact on their health. So we talk a lot about mental health at the moment. It is really key and it is really prevalent in terms of the communications that people are sharing. But actually, if you focus on the trans community, what I thought was really shocking was that 71% of trans people had experienced anxiety, and around 46%, the study showed, had considered taking their own lives, which is just awful, and re-emphasises again how important it is to support the trans community. So it'd be great to talk about, you know, what can we do as employers to make sure that we have got, you know, that we are championing gender identity and gender expression within the workplace. And I didn't know if you wanted to kick us off, Octavian, in terms of some of the challenges we should be thinking about in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, I think really seeking out organizations that are supportive to trans and gender diverse people. And I say trans and gender diverse because gender diverse covers a lot of people who might be questioning their gender identity. They may be gender diverse in ways where they don't necessarily identify as trans, but they might be seen that way. So, you know, somebody who might be identify as a man and was, you know, assigned male at birth, but might like to wear dresses and high heels. And actually, you're seeing quite a lot of men that are really into this, and they're not trying to look female or feminine. They just like to wear high heels. So, you know, I read an article the other day of I think he's a lawyer. I just saw an article on Facebook, and he goes to work every day in like a business shirt with a mini skirt and heels, and he identifies as a man. He's straight, you know. So I think, you know, gender expansive language is really important to remember that just because somebody may dress in a gender expansive way does not mean that they're trans. They might be gender diverse, but they may not be trans. They may not identify that as that way, or need some of the protections like using, you know, toilets or whatever that match their gender identity. So I think that's important. You know, having a really good list of supported places like GIRES website, which has, you know, a list of supported organizations across the country in the Trans Wiki, and all different types of guides to support different types of trans and gender diverse people, so BAB trans people and people who are religious. So, you know, there's lots of different things out there, making sure that there's whatever you have for everyone else, you have for trans people and gender diverse people. So if you have a hotline for mental health, you have the switchboard line for trans people and LGBT people to, you know, be able to call if they're feeling in distress, you know. So it's really thinking about also including trans people in everything you do. If you have a panel about Black History Month, do you have trans people there? You know, if you have a panel about, you know, how you're going to be changing the facilities at work, are there trans and gender diverse people in the room? You know, are they there? It's like that whole nothing for us without us kind of concept, because I think that's really important. I think it's important for all diversity, but I think it's really important to look, do we have representation? And if you don't have someone at work, you can find someone, you know, call GIRES, call another trans organization and say, hey, we don't have anyone at work that's willing to be on this panel for this thing, but we need somebody's point of view here. And look, there's enough pride networks across corporations and different, you know, I'm sure you can find someone at a partner organization that will come and talk to you. So I think it's those things, and people don't think about doing that, which is absolutely fine. And a lot of times, you know, all those small groups and all those small projects are usually on the side of your regular job and you're not getting paid for them. And, you know, it's something that's like a passion project. So people don't always think about these things. But I think really putting that to the forefront of your mind and saying, who's in the room? What are the conversations that we're having? And making sure that you're listening to those suggestions and you're implementing them. You know, in your kind of marketing and social media, are trans people just regularly kind of shown? Are they engaging? You don't even have to necessarily point that out all the time, but other trans people will know. Like, I can tell when I see a trans person in marketing material, most of the time I can be like, hey, wait a minute, you know. And it's like these little things where you don't have to make it a big deal, but putting those people in the room and making them part of the development of that makes a huge difference, because it shows the community that you have a commitment, which is good business, but also it shows the people that you're working with that you have a commitment and that you want to be a safe employer. And the more you do that, the more transgender diverse people will be like, that's a place I want to work. More young people who are transgender diverse be like, that's the company I want to work for when I get qualified. You know, it gives you a better standing to actually have a bigger pool of people as well, you know. But also, don't think of just trans and gender diverse people themselves. Think of their families. You know, everybody has a mom, right?
Yeah.
And the dad or dads or moms or lots of other parents. And everybody has people in their lives that they care about, partners, friends, other family members. And those people want to work for diverse companies as well. So it's not just trans people that you're thinking about. You're thinking about all of their people, you know, and all of their people's people. You know, they would much rather support, purchase, you know, and be employed by companies that are outwardly engaging with their trans employees and gender diverse employees.
I think that's a really good point, Octavian. And you know, from the get-go, as you say, it's making that safe environment known to those individuals that are even coming forward for a role. So we always talk about the recruitment process and, you know, and how you can make that more inclusive. And it's not simply adding another box on a form to say, rather than, you know, identifying as a particular gender, you can click other. Actually, it's so much more than that. So thinking about, you know, what are the challenges that somebody that might be coming forward for a role might face, you know, things like the background checks that need to be carried out. So, you know, for some people, providing previous names may be problematic. So sometimes the name on a, you know, a trans or gender diverse individual's documentation, such as passport, driver's license, you know, even qualification certificates, they just might not tally. So again, thinking about, as you were saying, you know, having somebody nominated within the organisation that, you know, a trans or a gender diverse candidate can reach out to and say, look, and know that that person's going to deal with these issues sensitively and confidentially. Because again, you know, one of the issues that we've seen is it's really important kind of what information is then retained at that stage to make sure that somebody, you know, isn't outed within the workplace as well. So making sure that that's kind of kept as confidential as possible and that that person's in control of what information is shared and when. So I think that's a really good point. And like you were saying, again, in terms of kind of taking that one step further and supporting individuals, thinking about the language that's used within documents, and that might sound really, really dull and really boring. But as a lawyer, I can say this because the amount of legal documents that lands on in our inbox and say, dear sirs, it's like, that's not how I identify. That's just kind of common language. Or there's a really lazy approach to saying, when talking about employees, he and him, and a throwaway clause to say also, or you know, if it's different gender, it also applies. It's like, well, put it in then, put what, you know, put the right labels in, or make it gender neutral is kind of the important bit. And we just done a really exciting piece of work with an organisation actually that has really wanted to champion gender identity within the workplace, and they've kind of taken that a step further, and things like family friendly policies we've moved away from using language that would have traditionally been used. So when we're talking about maternity, we talk about pregnant parent, because just because you know, you're giving birth to a child doesn't necessarily mean that you identify as the mother. So again, moving away from breastfeeding, talking about chest feeding, just like you said, Octavian, to make sure that, you know, people know within that organisation that the organisation is genuinely inclusive and genuinely it's a supportive employer that they don't need to hide their identity from. So I think that's really, really important. Emily, what are your thoughts in terms of, oh, sorry, Octavian.
Oh yeah, sorry. I'm just quickly to say, you know, that doesn't mean that people can't say things like motherhood or breastfeeding or, you know, and I think there's been a lot of I think a lot of concern by a lot of different people that, you know, by using gender expansive language, we're somehow erasing, you know, gendered language, and that some people, and I think we need to respect that some people prefer to use gender language. Look, I'm a very binary, it's called a binary trans person. So I really like gendered language for myself, but I try to use a lot of gender expansive language for everyone else. And I think we should also respect that sometimes in your policies and things, you could say, this doesn't mean you can't use gendered language for yourself or for other people if you want to, but just be mindful that if you're talking about people you don't know, using, you know, gender expansive language is just respectful, you know. But I think making, you know, specific kind of understanding that that doesn't mean you're erasing anybody's right to use gendered language is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. But like you say, it's just calling it out, isn't it, to say these are different ways that you can approach these discussions. Absolutely. Sorry, Emily. Yeah, your thoughts in terms of how we can champion gender identity and expression.
I think that a lot of it is to do, when you look at it from a HR perspective as well, is about data and how we're capturing data about people. You know, hopefully we're starting to move away now from, like you said, you know, where we have male, female, other, and expect other to be able to capture the intricacies and how somebody really identifies. You know, and that doesn't just go for gender identity, it goes for things like sexuality, religion, you know, all different things you can identify as. I think a really important one as well is honorifics, so the titles that you use to address people, such as Mr, Miss, Mrs, or, you know, Mix, and how they're captured within your HR systems. The more a company limits itself with those options, the more limited information that you're going to have to work with, and the more limited you'll be, like Octavian said, in the people that you're attracting. Because if the only options you've got are, you know, Mr, Miss and Mrs, that's automatically going to put somebody on the back foot if they are trans or gender diverse, as to whether that's a place that they want to be working at, or whether that's somewhere that they're going to be accepted for exactly who they are and not who we're trying to shoehorn them in to be. So the more data you have available, the better informed that you can be. And for example, it's, instead of having those, you know, limited options, it's having those breadth of gender classifications that you can use. And this can then help you break down employment matters as well. So, for example, if you have got all that data for you to use, you can start tracking trends such as absenteeism, mental health, things such as gender discrimination or bullying, or if, you know, grievances about harassment are getting raised constantly in the same business area, any trends in recruitment or attrition, that would then give insights into how inclusive a particular department is perceived to be. And, you know, you could even break that down directly into how inclusive a particular manager is being, and that then really helps you narrow down where either action or education needs to be entered into that discussion. And whatever a business decides is the right kind of identity data they want to capture, the HR systems across the board should be configured to support this. And at AdviserPlus, we advocate that technology should support the way that that works, not define it or limit it. And part of that is that your systems are integrated, so that if somebody does come forward and say, well, actually, you know, that's the incorrect name, you know, this is my name or this is my identity, that can be changed in the moment, and that can be reflected across the board immediately. And that helps then, you know, for that person who is going through whatever other struggles they might be going through, it's taken that additional struggle out, because that can be changed across the board and it doesn't have to come up again because it's done. So they're good ways that people can start looking at, you know, the systems that they use and the technology they use, and how that in itself can be supportive of these type of things.
Absolutely. detail in a moment, Emily, but actually just on that point, you know, not changing somebody's name on a system to their preferred name or their preferred pronouns actually can expose you to discrimination claims. We'll chat about that in a bit more detail in a moment, but going back to what you were saying in terms of how you record the information, like you were saying, even absence, you know, thinking through how your sickness absence policy allows you to record absences related to gender identity, you know, somebody struggling with their gender expression, for example, or maybe it is, you know, kind of for medical reasons linked. But with all of that in mind, making sure again that your policies are clear in terms of differentiating between the different types of absences, so that you're not treating it like you would with somebody else who's, you know, got a broken leg or is called in sick with, you know, with a cold. You know, how do we make sure that we differentiate so that we're not putting those absences towards sickness absence triggers? And the same with data protection, kind of as you were saying, you know, making sure that we've got a really clear policy that talks about retention of old records and what happens to them. So, you know, whether it's photographs or, you know, bios on a company website, or even historical information on personal records. So, for example, having a reference to a previous period of maternity leave for a transgender man, again, how can we make sure that that remains something that isn't, you know, accessible and avoids it being kind of misused or miscommunicated? You know, what records do you actually need, and making sure that they're accurately reflect the situation as it is, as you know it. So kind of taking that one step further then, Taven, and you touched on this earlier when you talked about, you know, gender diverse language, but ultimately, can you talk us through some of the terminology? Because I think, although, you know, I don't think anybody sets out to intentionally misuse terminology, but it is vast and ever changing, and I think it would be useful just to kind of chat through about, you know, what are some of the terms that we should be aware of, and what they mean, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think some of the main ones, of course, is, you know, trans. You see sometimes trans with an asterisk. To those academics and academic people and people who write policy, that will drive you nuts, because it usually, when you put an asterisk, it means that there's a cite somewhere or a citation. So that doesn't always work, but generally what the asterisk means is it's trans and gender diverse, right? It covers everyone in one small trans with an asterisk, right? So you can use it, you cannot use it, but that's what it means. There's trans, which is short for transgender. There is trans feminine, trans masculine. So that means somebody who is trans, but more on the feminine spectrum, trans more on the masculine spectrum. So trans woman, so that's somebody who identifies as a woman who is assigned male at birth. Trans man is somebody who was assigned female at birth and identifies as a man, so somebody like me. Then you have non-binary, which means that that's somebody who identifies as non-binary. So they don't identify as male or female, maybe somewhere in between, maybe sometimes male, maybe sometimes female, maybe something, nothing at all. Non-binary is very personal. And I think if you meet a non-binary person, just ask them what that means to them. Sometimes non-binary people will undergo a physical and social transition, like changing their name, using different toilets, you know, going on hormones, having gender confirmation surgeries. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes non-binary people identify as trans. Sometimes they don't. So again, this is sometimes, you know, talking to people about what that means to them. There's gender queer, which is, I like to say, the grandma of non-binary. So it's basically the same thing. I transitioned in 2001, and non-binary didn't exist till about 2010. So I think gender queer is the same thing, but you will sometimes hear people say that, especially if they are slightly older, like I am. You'll hear a term that's F to M, M to F. This is kind of going out of style, but again, I'm old, and so for me, this is something that's still attached to me when you're looking for resources. So what this means is female to male, male to female. Again, this is very binary, right? So it's people who transition from one thing to the other. So it's very binary, which is why it's kind of on its way out, because it's not as inclusive of non-binary people who might be trans feminine or trans masculine. So we're moving more towards trans feminine, trans masculine. And again, let's not negate people who want to be binarily gendered. You know, I think just because we have inclusive language doesn't mean that people can't choose binary language, right? So I think that's really important. And so some people will still use F to M and M to F. I don't think that it's offensive, but you might find younger people who might find it offensive. So just be mindful and just be respectful of the fact that it's not necessarily offensive. Just read the room. You have, you know, some terminology that is, you might see a legal terminology. So you have transsexual. So you will see that sometimes in people's medical documents, in some legal documents. So right now, so people used to be diagnosed to receive gender confirmation treatment, so hormones or surgery, with transsexualism, right? A very long time ago. But you may have some people whose documentation still has this if they transitioned a very long time ago. And I mean, we're talking back in the 80s to early 90s, right? It was changed around, I think, the mid 90s. So, you know, but there are people, right? It wasn't that long ago. So there are people who may have that on their medical paperwork, and it's best to just leave it there. You know, it is a very medical term. It's actually even not even used in medical terminology quite a lot these days, but it's still kind of only acceptable in that way. Now, you will find some people who might identify that way. They might say, I'm a transsexual. Usually this is people who were diagnosed at that time, back in the day. It might be a bit older. It's a read the room situation. Generally, it is seen as offensive by a lot of people. And so it's one of those things of, yes, I see that this is positive for you, but people may take it the wrong way because it is on the other end of being phased out. You know, I think there's terminology like, you know, tranny, which is a very offensive term and should not be used pretty much ever. However, I have noticed that there's a lot of young people, particularly trans feminine people, who seem to be wanting to take this back, this term, and sometimes will use this in reference to themselves. Now, this is another not acceptable in general conversation. Even if that person identifies that way, it's not socially seen as a reclaiming word yet. And so I don't think it ever will, really. But people using that in a general context, especially in the workplace, people are going to think that's okay when widely it's not. And so that's a read the room situation. And a difficult conversation I had to have with somebody, with their employer fairly recently, where we said, you know, we understand, but not everyone does. And so you need to keep this to, you know, small personal company. Yeah. And so that is a word that's not, you know, a lot of people get transvestite confused with people who are trans. So transvestite is somebody who's generally a cisgender, so a non-trans person, a man usually, who likes to dress up in women's clothing. And that is not a trans person. They might be gender expansive, but that's not a trans person, right? That's somebody who identifies as cisgender who likes to wear certain kinds of clothing, and that's different. So let's not call trans people transvestites. And also some people can identify that way and then move forward. If we think about Eddie Izzard, used to identify as a transvestite and now identifies as trans feminine, non-binary, and, you know, is on a journey physically. So, you know, that took, what, 20 years. So some people have a long journey and terminology will change with that person. So just because they may identify one way, you know, 5 years from now, they could identify differently. So, you know, language moves and shifts, which is important to talk about. You know, I think some other things to think about is, you know, the word sex change. So it kind of makes me feel like people think people go into a machine and then they come out the other way. It doesn't really work that way, and it doesn't define someone. You know, our bodies don't define us. And a lot of people have different reasons and different, you know, stipulations of why they can do certain things. Maybe they're in a family of which they can't physically transition because it's physically dangerous for them to do so. They might be in a place where they have other medical conditions, which means they can't take hormones or can't have surgery. There might be probably is financial implications. You know, the waiting lists for trans care is anywhere from 2 to 6 years, depending on what you're waiting for. So, you know, a lot of people may want these things and it's just completely unattainable to them. Also to remember that, you know, gender confirmation or, you know, gender confirmation surgeries or any kind of gender affirmative procedures, a lot of people do, not just trans people. So things like Botox, you know, what's that? It's a gender affirmative procedure, right? It's making you feel good in your gender presentation. And while people don't think about that, you know, a lot of people have breast augmentation, breast reduction, you know, men get Botox and fillers in their jawlines to make them more square. People get liposuction. People get all kinds of implants in their chests for different reasons. You know, people get all kinds of things, right? And those are all gender affirmative procedures. So I think it's important to say that it's not just trans people who do gender affirmation, right? And that can sometimes help in understanding this language. I think it's really important to realize that we're at a place now where sometimes you just have to ask. If you don't know the terminology, that's okay. And realize that trans people may not also know. So, you know, there are some people who are like, well, I know the terminology that I want and don't want for myself, but I may not know what other people might want. You know, I know a lot of people who are trans and gender diverse who know one person, and that's usually me, and they don't have any more community. Like if you have people who are, you know, trans who transitioned quite young, or they transitioned in a rural area, they may not have like a community, right? So they may not have the knowledge to tell you what terms are okay and what aren't okay. So that's why, you know, having that list, like I mentioned before, of where people can go to get terminology lists, and having a terminology list at work is really useful. And just saying, this is what we as a company find acceptable, and this is what we find unacceptable, also makes it really easy for HR. Because it means that they can go and say, well, when you signed up, this was in the policy list, and it's really clear that this is okay and this is not okay, right? And if other terminology comes up that you've never heard of before, then you check with organizations to say, is this okay or not okay? And then you can update the list, right? And, you know, language does move and change all the time, right? So it's important to keep up on that and to check it kind of, you know, yearly to see if anything needs to be shifted or changed.
I think that's a great point, Octavian. So, I mean, we're massive champions of having a gender identity policy or a trans inclusion policy in the workplace, and having kind of a glossary page, you know, terminology within that, as you say, that you can keep kind of going back to as a regular reference point, is a really useful tool. Because, as you say, you know, for a lot of people, this is new terminology that they're not familiar with, and they, you know, possibly are worried about saying the wrong thing, or they're getting misinformation as well about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So I think that's a really good point. And as you say, kind of speaking to the experts in terms of, right, has the situation moved on since we've last looked at this? Do we need to make those changes?
And I think remembering too that not all trans people are political, right?
Yeah.
And some trans people view their transitions very medically. So I think this is a slightly smaller percentage of people from my perspective, but you know, there are some people who are like, well, this is a medical condition. I receive a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So, you know, when you get diagnosed now, you receive a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. It used to be classified as a mental health condition. It no longer is. That changed in 2019, which a lot of people don't know. And now, you know, the official classification is gender incongruence or gender dysphoria. And so it is an actual medical condition under the sexual health category, and it's no longer a mental health disorder. And so a lot of trans people are like, well, I have a medical condition. I went to a doctor. I got a diagnosis. I take medication. I may have surgery. That's it. It's just like anything else. I don't want to talk about it. It's not part of my identity, and I don't want to get involved with terminology or anything like that. So I think it's important to recognize that there are a lot of people like that as well. And
Yeah.
they may not be tapped in. They probably aren't tapped in to what's new or what's fresh or any of that, and they don't care. So,
No.
you know, that's important to say as well.
So if we were to take that one step further then and think about a hypothetical situation where you've got a colleague that wants to share their experience with you as their employer, or as, you know, has decided to transition, what might that employee be worrying about, and how can we kind of best support as an employer in that situation? So what can we do as the employer and the managers?
So really looking at your policies, do you have a transition at work policy? That is the best way to know that you're going to be consistently supportive, because, you know, different managers understand different things. Different HR professionals understand different things. So you want to make sure that the message that you're giving to your employees is consistent, because this is a problem that I've run into before. I have companies call me and they say, well, this one person had a really good experience, but then that HR person left, and then somebody else came out at work, and then it was completely the opposite experience, right? And so that was because they didn't have a transition at work policy, right? Now they do. But I think if you have a very specific policy to say, okay, if someone comes out, this is what you do, this is what you don't do, this is who you talk to, this is how you share the information, this is how you do a memorandum of understanding with that person. So for us, we love the word memorandum of understanding. So this is an agreement. You sit down with this person, you say, that's great. You know, always be affirmative, always be positive, and say, That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing this incredibly personal information about yourself. And, you know, think about it. In most cases, people wouldn't have to tell you that they have medical conditions or things like that, right? It's not something you have to share very often. And so be really understanding of that. Okay, you do have to tell me this because we do have to change things. Thank you so much for coming to me. We've got a transition at work policy, so we're just going to go through what kind of things you expect from us, what we can expect from you, the kind of things that we need to consider. You know, are you going to be taking time off? What's that going to look like? How does that feed into our policies around sickness? You know, because you have to understand too that in that policy you have to have maybe more expansive sickness days, because some trans people have to have multiple surgeries that are like 6 weeks to 8 weeks recovery time. Some people may have complications and then have to go back into hospital. And a lot of these surgeries are very serious. And so they take quite a lot of recovery. And some people may have to have quite a few gender expansive or, you know, gender affirmative procedures, which make it very difficult for them to work, or maybe they have to have more flexibility in terms of working from home. So those are kind of things that you think about when you're doing a memorandum of understanding with somebody who's about to transition. But the biggest things are be positive, be confident. And that's why I say, you know, having these policies there before someone comes out is really important, because that means you're super confident. And it's like, oh, that's fine. There's a professional that deals with that. Even if you're not, you know the person that does. It's in the policies, you know it exists. It's not a big deal. And that makes the employee feel much better too, because that automatically will make somebody be like, oh, this is going to be okay. You know, they've thought about this before I came out. There's a policy in place. I'm okay. Also understand, when employees know that you're about to have this policy, it will probably be used right away. I'm about to train on the transition at work policy for a corporate that is just about to roll it out. Now, this has been written by their gender expansive colleagues and passed, and they already know that there are at least 5 people that are going to use this policy the second it comes out. So they know that. And so this will happen too. Know that when you write this policy and you put it out, probably people are going to use it right away, because now they feel that they're going to be respected and protected. Because I think one of the biggest things that people are worried about is that it's going to be really difficult. They're going to have to explain a lot of things to you that you're not going to understand. There's not going to be provision for it. They're not going to be able to change things. They're not going to be able to use the correct facilities. They're going to get a lot of bullying and harassment at work, and they're not going to be able to get any support for it, and they're going to lose their job. That is what trans people tell me all the time. They're like, well, I don't want to come out at work because I need this job. I need to feed myself. I need to feed my cats. I need to feed my family. I need to be able to do the things that people need to do under capitalism. And if I come out, I know that there is a risk that I'll lose my job, because I've seen that. I know the statistics, right? Yeah. And also, only 38% of trans people are in work. And a lot of people, you know, have had a lot of issues with so much discrimination. You know, I know a lot of trans feminine people who get discriminated against every single day they leave their house, never fails, even if that's one comment from a car, right? So when people are experiencing that level of harassment, they don't even report it. You know, the statistics that we have for hate crimes are way low, and they're high, you know, but they're very low. I can tell you, most of the people I know who experience daily abuse, they don't ever tell anyone, because they're like, well, what difference is it going to make? You know, it's going to happen anyway. And a lot of times it's microaggressions, but that stuff builds up. And so an employee is going to be worried that all of that's going to happen at work, and it's exhausting. So if you have policies in place, if you have an inclusive workplace, that person is going to feel already more comfortable that they're going to be able to do this without it impacting their life or their work. And that's the biggest thing that people are worried about, which is why a lot of people will quit when they transition. Is they'll quit, they'll transition for a little while, then they'll go back into a different job.
Yeah, there's a lot of statistics on that, isn't there? And then lower paid level work. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is important to call out what protection does exist in terms of the law. So, and I know I'm telling you things you already know, but just for completeness. So obviously the Equality Act includes gender reassignment as a protected characteristic. And just to kind of expand on that slightly further, so that doesn't mean that somebody has to have any kind of, you know, hormones or medical procedures or anything like that. If that individual recognises themselves as, you know, living their life as another gender, they are absolutely caught by that protection, and rightfully so. And we all have probably heard about the case, the Taylor case a couple of years ago now, that extended that right further to protect those that recognise as non-binary as well. To be honest, it's a pretty new area of the law, so I'm expecting a lot more cases to come through over the next few years and expand on this further. But at the moment, that's where we're at. And in terms of, without getting technical around different discrimination legislation that exists, I think it's important to kind of call out the key headlines, which are, you know, ultimately, they have the right not to be treated unfavourably or differently. And, you know, we kind of, well, I think we all hope that that goes without saying, but unfortunately, it's not always the case, and the statistics show us that. And taking that one step further, the right not to be harassed. Now, harassment from an employment law perspective doesn't carry the same definition that we would probably use in day-to-day English language of somebody being stalked, for example. So harassment from an employment law perspective is all around unwanted conduct. And that could be something verbal, like the example you gave, Octavian, so somebody shouting something through the car at you. It could be written down, it could be physical. So any unwanted conduct that relates to that protected characteristic of gender reassignment and has the purpose or the effect, so even if it's not intended, to make that person feel offended, humiliated, degraded. If it ticks those boxes, then it will amount to harassment for employment law purposes. And it's not always obvious. So the example that I often talk about is, and again, you usually get the response of, well, that's not what I was intending. So if somebody, a colleague finds out that another colleague is a trans colleague, and starts asking questions. Oh, what were you previously known as? What, you know, so what were you, you know, what gender were you assigned at birth? What procedures have you had? That's all really intrusive questions, and quite frankly, you know, that person's just being nosy and has no right to know that information. And it would be very you know, it would be very appropriate for the person that's on the receiving end of that to say that that amounts to harassment, because presumably being asked those questions about, you know, what they used to be known as, that's not who they are. That's not, you know, that's not something that they possibly want to talk about at all. So actually that could well amount to unwanted conduct relating to their protected characteristic. And does it make them feel, you know, offended, humiliated, degraded? Probably all of the above, and therefore it would absolutely meet the test for harassment in employment law purposes. Another one that we get, and you touched on it earlier, Octavian, the bathroom question. We had £1 for every time we were asked as to what bathroom somebody should use. It feels really obvious, but unfortunately we do get asked the question. So ultimately, if a you know, trans female, as an example, asks or kind of shares that information with you, which toilet should she use? The female toilet. You know, trans female is a female, and therefore that's the toilet. But ultimately the question is, whatever gender identity they feel best suits them, that is the toilet that they should be using. What we shouldn't be doing, and we get asked this question quite a lot, is should we be asking them to use the disabled toilet? No, they're not disabled. I guess something else that employers could look to introduce, which I know won't be practical for many organisations, is having a gender neutral bathroom. So again, that would support individuals that perhaps identify as non-binary, or you know, other gender diverse individuals that we've talked about, Octavian. But ultimately, because that could be a challenge in terms of which bathroom that they feel most comfortable to use. So if you can do that, I guess that would be a good step to take. But ultimately, it's down to the individual in terms of which identity, which gender identity they feel more comfortable with, and therefore which bathroom they should be using, right? Do you find that happens? Yeah. That's a question you get asked a lot.
Yeah, it's like question number one. I think the biggest thing is there's a lot of talk about, you know, people being, you know, cis women. So cisgender means somebody who is assigned the gender that, you know, they've assigned a gender at birth and they identify with it, right? And transgender means that they don't identify with the gender they were given at birth, right? I forgot those in the terminology, so about that. And also to say that cis is not a term that anybody made up for anyone. It's literally the opposite of trans. It comes from Latin. I've heard this a little bit of people saying, don't label me as cis. It's not a label, it's a descriptor. So it's not, nobody's come up with it. It's literally just the opposite of trans. And I can tell you right now, even if I didn't want to identify as trans, people would identify me that way. So I don't really have a choice either. So I think it's important to realize that there is a huge discussion around the safety of cis women in bathrooms, particularly, right? And there is no registered cases of there being any issues in this realm. Of course, is there bad people in every group of people? 100%. But would you deal with them in any other way you would deal with any other bad person? Yes. And there are cis women who unfortunately can do bad things as well, right? So everybody can do bad things, and it is terrible, and nobody wants that. But if that happened, if anyone harassed anybody anywhere, regardless of where it is, that person would be dealt with swiftly, right? Like that would happen. But there's no registered cases of this. And so generally what we're seeing though is that there are a lot of registered people of specifically trans women being harassed in toilets, you know? And there was a trans man the other day who was told to use the women's toilet and then arrested because he did so. Right. So, you know, this is a huge problem. You know, trans people just want to go to the toilet. Like anyone else, and they aren't disabled. So actually telling a trans person who is not disabled, like trans people may be disabled. I'm trans and I'm also disabled. But so if they're not disabled, they should not be told to use the disabled toilet, because that's actually a breach of the disabled person's rights. Right? So we have to remember that disabled people are also under the Equalities Act, and you don't want to, you know, take away their only toilet, because disabled people can only use that one toilet, right? If they need that toilet, that's the only toilet they can use. So don't tell a whole bunch of people that don't need that toilet to use that toilet, because then the other person can't use it and they're at a disadvantage. So it's important to note that, of course, if there's a problem, you deal with it, but there could be a problem anywhere. And trans men could be harassed in the men's toilet as well, although we have no documentation for that whatsoever. And nobody seems to be worried whether that'll happen either. So, you know, it's interesting that most of the fear is around trans feminine people, and that's pretty much it. Like, nobody really talks about trans men. I could get into a whole thing about why that is, but that's a whole other day. I think, you know, we need to really think about what is actually happening over what people are worried about will happen. And of course, if something happens, you will deal with it. It needs to be clear that you will, that any type of abuse, harassment, or anything will be dealt with very swiftly. But the actual reality of what is really happening or what has happened is just those fears are not substantiated at this time. And I think it's really important to realize that what is actually happening is that trans feminine people are being harassed to the point where they don't use the toilet at all. Absolutely. And I think you don't want people wanting to not be able to use the facilities at work or at school. You know, I know so many young people who have really bad UTIs and really bad liver problems and kidney problems at under 18 years old because they refused to use the toilet because they were being abused and harassed by other students and teachers and told that they couldn't use the toilet, so they just didn't. Gosh. You know, and you see that in the workplace as well, where people are like, well, I don't feel safe. I don't know what's going to happen to me. I don't want people to harass me, so I'll just wait. And that's not great. We all know that physically we shouldn't be doing it, right? So, you know, I think it's important to recognize that when you make policies like this, when you talk to people about this, when you don't include trans people in the conversations of facilities management, it means that you have a lot of people that are at a disadvantage you probably don't even know about. And no one's going to tell you that, because how embarrassing is it to say, I don't feel comfortable going to the toilet and I'm a grown adult?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Emily, how can managers best support their colleagues then in these discussions? What are some of the things that they could be doing?
I think it's all, to pick up on Octavian's points, it's all about empowering those managers to have positive gender identity conversations right from the get-go, and to give them the confidence that they know what they're talking about. Because I think a lot of the time people are worried about putting their foot in it or saying the wrong thing, and so they just don't have the conversation whatsoever. And that's not the right thing to do, because if we're not having the conversation, again, the person that's being put at the disadvantage is the person that needs your support, the person that needs your help in accessing what they need to access or changing what they need to change. So managers need to have that information at their fingertips. They need to be informed regularly about updates to policies and processes. And it's about creating that environment as a HR professional within a company to make sure those managers feel like they're on safe journeys that ensure that they are well prepared, but also that gives them that confidence that they're not going to step outside of anything, and that they're well supported themselves. For example, AdviserPlus's Empower solution provides guided journeys that take managers through a process or a policy step by step, and that helps them in how to approach employee relations matters, how to have these type of conversations, in a really proactive way, and it can also provide them the latest information, so things like documentation, checklists, glossaries, and all of these can be changed. You know, as we've said, language changes, you know, things move forward, and you know, what was acceptable 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago is, you know, certainly not what's acceptable today. So we need to be able to make sure that managers are confident that when they're accessing that information, it is the most up-to-date information and it's the correct thing they should be using. So at every step of that process, we need to make sure as HR professionals that those managers have access to everything they need in the moment to create a positive experience. Because what your hope would be is if the manager can access all that information and they're having a positive experience with that process, that's then going to be cascaded down to the employee and they're going to have a positive process. And like Octavian said, when they come forward and they say, you know, this is who I am and this is what I need to tell you, whether I want to tell you or not, this is what I need you to know, that rather than that being a drawn out awkward process, the moment that that manager feels confident and says, right, I've got this, like I've got you, that employee can then feel like, whew, okay, like it's fine and it's going to be okay, and everyone knows exactly what they're doing. So that's what we need to be doing for managers, so that managers then feel empowered to do that for their employees.
I think absolutely. In terms of what Octavian said about the memorandum of agreement, Octavian, you know, it means that you've got all of that captured as you work through that process, Emily, as you say, to think about, right, well, what communications are we sharing with when, how, who to, you know, making that individual feel like they're not losing control of their journey as well. And as you say, that the managers feel empowered to kind of support them through it and to know exactly what that individual is expecting from them as well. So to make sure, you know, I think Octavian, you touched on it earlier, no two experiences are ever going to be the same, are they? There's lots of personal circumstances that have to be factored in, like you said, family, background, religion, race, all of those things that might play into kind of somebody's experience and how they might want to progress that journey. And you know, it's such a personal experience that it's right that that person has that control to input and keep hold of it as they see fit. Okay, well, just to kind of summarize where we've got to then, I can't believe where the time's gone already. Thank you so much. I think, you know, we've covered off importantly the difference around gender identity, gender expression, and kind of what it is and what it means. How somebody might be gender diverse and not necessarily identify as a trans person, how we can champion gender identity through the workplace and kind of support somebody's experience, so from the language we're using in documents, policies, having the right policies in place to start with, so a trans inclusion policy or a gender identity policy, just so that, again, like you say, Octavian, it's not just for the individual that kind of might be going through that experience, but also to know that we're, you know, you're a supportive employer, and for their loved ones who, you know, will be looking for these things that are important to them, to kind of see that synergy and values, to know that that's an organisation that they want to stay loyal to and to support in return as well. And as we said, you know, it is an ever-changing area that, you know, we're getting more and more information through. So we mentioned the 2021 census, you know, crazy to think that that's taken until now to kind of ask that as a question in terms of gender identity. But it is being recognised, it is being championed, and I think as a result of that, you know, it's making sure that we're staying up to date on this, on, you know, these important topics. And as you say, reaching out to kind of organisations that can provide that expertise to make sure that a terminology that you've got within a policy is staying up to date, or the approach that you're taking to support individuals is relevant and appropriate as well. I think we've got time for a couple of really quick questions. So if I just pick off a couple that have come through to me. So the first one being, how do you deal with conflicting characteristics? I think that's a really interesting question. Are you all right if I jump in first, both of you? So we've had a couple of cases on this recently, actually, and I'll pick off the one that I think is kind of most relevant as precedent. So it was a case involving a doctor, actually, who was religious. He was of Christian faith, and as a doctor, he insisted on using pronouns related to the sex that his patients were assigned at birth rather than their preferred pronouns, and was ultimately dismissed on this basis. He argued that he'd been discriminated against based on his religious views, and ultimately what the tribunal held was no, basically because his beliefs infringed on somebody else in that way, that ultimately his his claim was unsuccessful, then it was held that ultimately his view wasn't protected by the Equality Act on this basis, and that ultimately he should have been identifying individuals as their preferred pronouns. So I think that's a really important reminder of ultimately where you have got conflicting characteristics, that you have got the, it's important to make sure that somebody's entitled to have their belief, but making sure it doesn't infringe on another. There's a bit of a kind of a red herring case that came out relatively recently that I would definitely say handle with caution. So similar principle, it was an individual that was posting their views online, which were kind of anti gender diversity basically, and ultimately was dismissed as a result. Again, brought a claim to say that it was unfair dismissal, and kind of got home on it on a technicality. So the only reason that they got home on it was purely because ultimately the employer didn't have clear enough policies in place about social media use, and because it was behaviour outside of work and they hadn't been prescriptive enough about what was acceptable and what wasn't, that was the grounds that they were able to kind of succeed on their claim. So I would say handle with care, because that's certainly not a green light for people to be able to inflict on somebody else's rights in that way. I've got time for one more question. Is there anything that either of you wants to add on that one? Sorry, Emily and Octavian.
Yeah, I just want to say, there are many protected characteristics, and of course there can be some conflicting things, and there's a lot of beliefs within a lot of different systems. And remember, just because someone says they're a Christian doesn't mean that means that they're anti anybody. There are a lot of people who also believe that being a Christian, it's not okay to say certain things, and that religions are very subjective to how that person is relating to that religion, right? So that's important to say. But also, there's a lot of beliefs under religion that we would know. Somebody could believe that gay people should be murdered, right? They could hold that belief under the law. So they could hold that belief, and there are people who do. However, would it be acceptable for them to say that at work?
No.
Absolutely not, right? So it would not be okay for someone to say that at work, because it is their religiously held belief. They are able to believe that, under the equalities law, if they wish. However, if they said that at work, would that be okay? No, it wouldn't, right? Because it would automatically, we would know that would infringe on someone's rights. I think we don't know a lot about trans people. Trans people are like 1 to 3% of the population. There's never going to be a lot of us. We've been around since the dawn of time. There is gender diverse people throughout history, but it's always going to be a small community, right? It's never going to be a big community. So there's always going to be a lack of knowledge and understanding and confidence in which talking about trans and gender diverse people, we're going to feel a little bit uncomfortable sometimes if we don't know things. And I think sometimes people don't know if it's okay, but I think we just need to remember, if somebody is saying, look, I believe that person doesn't exist, when they do, then, that is, you can say, well, you can hold that belief, but obviously they exist and that impinges on their life, right? So I think it's important to just keep it very simple and say, of course, people can hold whatever beliefs they want. And also they need to be respected to be able to hold those beliefs. As hard as it is for me to know that there are people who think that I shouldn't exist, I respect their right to believe that,
Mm-hmm.
And I think everybody should have a respect to believe that, but the law very clearly states that stops when it starts affecting someone else, and I very much would not air my beliefs on how I feel about people feeling that way about me, because I respect their right to have that belief. So it goes both ways,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Just time for one more quick question then. So ultimately, am I as an employer responsible for an employee upsetting a trans colleague? The short answer is probably yes. So ultimately, you are responsible from a discrimination point of view, certainly from the act of harassment. You can be responsible for your employees' actions. There are certain things that you can do to show that you've done everything you can to prevent them from taking those actions, and that ultimately the person that has been upset or offended by those actions should be suing the individual directly. But the reality is that employers don't like that. Tribunals don't like that approach. So the short answer is yes. But I'm conscious of time, so for anyone that we haven't managed to get to your questions or we haven't answered as fully, we will follow up with you. So we are making a note of the questions that you've asked so that we can do so. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much to Octavian and Emily for your input today. It's been super interesting for me, and yeah, we'll be sure to kind of pop an email across to anyone that's joined today with a copy of the recording and any further information that you're asking for. So thank you again, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.